Welcome to the shop, everyone. Today we're going to be checking the oil clearances on the bottom end of this 454 big block build and installing the crankshaft. Now, to get the oil clearances or the bearing oil clearances, I like to go to each individual rod or main bearing journal and take a measurement. And then off that measurement, I have a dial bore gauge that I'll set to 0 and then measure each one individually, because you know the journals on the crankshaft can vary, the bearings themselves can vary, the bore housing can vary, so you have several places that things can change slightly. And sometimes any machinist out there knows you can have compilement. That's where like they all go in a direction to make like the oil clearance larger than you'd want, so you can manipulate all those things. Say you have two bearing shells that are a little thicker or a little thinner, or you have a housing on one of the rods or two of the rods that's a little bit tighter, and you can manipulate those to like the crankshaft where the journals may be not as full as the others. So that's what I do, is I go through and I measure each individual journal on the crankshaft, and then I'll take do like I have a bearing mic, and I'll go through the bearings and pick out the slightly thicker ones and the slightly thinner ones. And when I go through the engine, I'll pick their place that I think they best fit to get the oil clearance that I'm shooting for on a particular build. So I'll take a torque wrench, torque everything down. I've got that ARP rod bolt assembly lube on there. I'll take my dial bore gauge, take a measurement, see what my oil clearance is, and I'll just keep redoing this procedure all the way through the crankshaft at each journal. Checking to make sure I got the upper on the upper side, the lower on the lower side. Then this ARP lube, I think it's cousins to anti-seize. You know, the stuff goes everywhere. But just use a brush to brush it on the threads. Then I can use the brush to do the seat and the upper part of the bolt. Run it down with my little impact. Stick it in my rod vise. Torque it to the torque reading that I like. Now I'm ready to measure that oil clearance. So measure the journal for that rod. Zeroed my dial bore gauge, and I'm checking number 4 for its oil clearance. And so I did that the whole way through the crankshaft. Now I'm on number 8. Get a good measurement there. Zero my gauge to that journal. Get my bearings into that rod. Now you see the box over there, I have numbered number 8. So I have gone through this before, and I did pick the bearings that I thought best suited each journal of the crank as far as dimension wise to get my correct oil clearance I'm shooting for on this engine build. Get my ARP rod bolt lube on there. Now, to get the rod bolt torque, what I do is I also have a rod bolt stretch gauge. And what I'll end up doing is I'll take at least maybe 3 rods and make sure that has the right lube on there for the bolts, and then I'll take the recommended torque setting and I'll torque it, and then with my rod stretch bolt gauge, as we call it, I'll measure it, and I'll keep changing my torque wrench until I start reading the correct stretch for each bolt, and that's how I'll come to the correct torque wrench setting for my rod bolts. So now we're ready to get onto the main bearings of the engine. Just stripping all my bolts and caps off. Use my dead blow hammer to help get them loose. Especially with the studs. With the studs in there, it's really hard to get these things loose sometimes. Alright, so there's my H-series bearings, and they got upper and lowers too. Now the uppers will usually have the groove in there for the oil, so they're pretty easy to understand which one goes on there. But there's also fully grooved bearings too. I'm just using the half grooved ones for this engine. Now installing them on my caps. Now you'll see that the oil pump is installed on the rear cap, and it does make a difference on your oil clearance with it bolted up. So I like bolting it up to get my oil clearance measurement. So putting the APR rod bolt lube on the studs. So I'll do like one at a time so I can get my dial bore gauge in there without hitting the other ones. So I'm starting at the back, working forward, putting the oil pump on there. And I'm going to torque it down to the recommended torque setting. Alright, so I've zeroed it to the rear journal on the crankshaft, and I'm measuring my oil clearance. So I'm doing number 4 journal now, and I'll do the same, repeat the same thing, get the lube on there and the washers, bolts, and the tightening the main caps up. I usually do it in like 3 settings. So I'll set it to a lower setting and torque it, then keep going up until I come up to the recommended setting for those studs. Measuring number 4. I'm going to set my dial bore gauge to number 4's journal. Zero it. Now I'll see what my oil clearance is. And then I'll just keep repeating that until I get all the way to the number 1 main cap. Now, if your clearances don't come up to what you want, there's several ways you can go about getting them there. They sell bearings with an X on the end for extra, so they give you a little extra clearance, and also you can get 1 under bearings too. And then also, you can go through your bearings and find the ones that are slightly thicker, slightly thinner. You can go through your main bores and find out which ones might have a little extra clearance and a little bit tighter, and you can, you know, move bearings around accordingly to get to the oil clearance that you're shooting for on your engine build. So we're on number 2. Same thing again. Checking it. Alright, so now we're finally on number 1 main cap. Same procedure again. Now, once the oil clearances are where I want them on this build, at that point I'll be ready to install the crank for good. Now, it has been in and out of this motor several times and manipulating everything to get the oil clearances that I want. I always check the front and the back to make sure they're the same. You'll find taper sometimes. Literally all the time. There's rarely that they're both exactly the same. There'll be a little bit of taper in them. Just nothing super extreme. So I'm putting assembly oil on the bearings. Get the rear end back there. Now I've already set the rear main seal in. Already have the rear main seal and the rear cap. Assembly lube on them. Now the crankshaft, I'm going to do one last blow off, blow through all the holes, make sure there's nothing, dust or anything in any of the holes. Now I'm going to set it in the engine, being very careful I don't nick it on any of those studs sticking up. Feels nice. I'm going to install the rear cap. I already have the seal up in it. Put my ARP lube on there. Get the right torque readings. Making sure all the washers are on there. Now, I always try to align the caps up to make sure they're sort of aligned with each other from the top and bottom before I tighten them down. So I'm heating the crankshaft back and forth with a dead blow to set the rear thrust bearing. Make sure it's in line. So now I'll go through with probably 3 different settings of torque, finally till I reach the value that's recommended for these studs. And I will go over them more than once. You always have that dread that you missed one and one's not torqued, so I always go back over everything just to make sure. The crankshaft feels good in there. So let's check our thrust bearing clearance. Zero it, move it back and forth with a screwdriver. Looks good. Very happy with that. So another thing I've been taught to do, I think it's a really good idea, is I might not work on this engine for another week, another month. And so while it's fresh in my mind, I always mark the bolts that I know are torqued to the correct setting. So if I come back in a month, 2 months, and look at that, I know those bolts have been torqued and I don't have to redo it. So the crankshaft feels really good, turns really nice. So the next thing that we'll be doing is installing the pistons onto the rods, putting the rings on the pistons, and inserting the pistons into the block and torquing it down. So if you guys enjoyed the video, please hit the like, share, and subscribe. And we hope to see you on the next project. Hey, thanks so much.